Pleased that you could join me for another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about today is how to teach social emotional learning. But more specifically, how do you teach social emotional learning in a virtual setting? So, what I'm going to start with is what is social emotional learning? And social emotional learning, in a nutshell, is being able to manage one's emotions. So, if you get angry, you figure out productive ways to express this. If you are really excited, you find ways to tamper this so that you're not disturbing others. So, it's just managing your emotions, and because you can manage your emotions, you can do other things such as form relationships, show empathy for others. Most importantly, is making good, sound decisions. This is also known as emotional intelligence, and this can be more important than the academic intelligence that oftentimes we focus on in school. So we need to balance the social emotional learning with the academics. And so we try to be purposeful about making sure that students are having their needs tended to, whether it be their emotional needs or that they need an outlet of some sort or something, someone just to listen to. Social emotional learning can be really important. It can be especially important in the current times where things are at an all-time stress level, not just amongst students, but amongst teachers as well. And so how do we ensure that our students are getting the social emotional learning that they need in a virtual setting? Here's a visual to show you what social emotional learning breaks down into. So it's basically self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, which again leads to then responsible decision making. When you're in a regular classroom, you can tend to these. You can see students, all day long. You see if something is bothering them. You see if they have an issue that they need that needs tending to. It's easier in a live setting to see the signs when students need social emotional learning tended to when you're in a live setting. So the question becomes then, what do you do in a virtual setting where you are not having the face to face all the time, where you're not able to have necessarily those close interactions that you would in a live classroom? So in the virtual environment, what are signs that you can look for, or what are things that you can do in order to help with this social emotional learning? So the first thing that you can do as a teacher is that you can look for signs of needing help in the virtual setting. And how do you do this? What does this look like? So the most obvious one is when students are acting out of character. So for example, a student who has always produced really high quality work starts turning in work that is shoddy or is not up to par. Or a student who typically would get assignments in and all of a sudden they're not turning them in anymore, or they're missing class meetings, or they're just being irresponsible where before they had been pretty responsible. So this change in behavior can be a sign that maybe something is going on that needs tending to. And of course, for that to work, you have to have personal relationships with your students and you have to know them well. And that's why forming those relationships with students is so important. So that's an obvious way that you can look for signs that a student needs help with their social emotional learning. Another thing that you can use is body language. And so this is looking at a student and seeing that they're either tired or they're disengaged, or they just seem stressed, or there are lots of, and you can actually see these if you're doing a Zoom call or a Google Meet. And this brings up the debate of should students have to have their cameras on during class? And I am on the side of yes, they should. Only because I want to be looking at their body language so that I can tend to their social emotional learning or social emotional needs. It's not, and I know some people make the argument that when students don't turn on their cameras, it may be because they're embarrassed about their home or whatever. But I think just making sure that you have students do that, or if they are embarrassed about that, having a private conversation with them where you can kind of meet their needs there, but also have conversations with them one-on-one. So maybe a kid is not turning their camera on, and so you ask to have a private conversation with them breakout room, and then you ask them to turn their camera on, and you can read from that as well. So you don't want to cause more stress for students, but at the same time, you want to be able to see the signs as they're happening. Another thing that you can do is you can, look at the work that they're turning in, especially if you are asking them to do reflections. I try to, as much as possible, have students do reflections where they're sharing their emotions in productive ways, or they're showing what their frustrations or whatever. And so, students will, if you give them a platform to tell you about some of their problems, they'll be more than welcome or willing to do that. And so you have to give them the platform for that. And then you have to look for those signs as you're looking through there. So if you ask students to do a poetry unit and they're writing poems, and in that poetry unit, they express like, a depression, you have a conversation with that student. I know it's uncomfortable to have that conversation, but it's important to have that conversation with them. Or if you were in a math class and you ask them to, share, how they felt about the last unit, and they share that they were very frustrated. Well, again, having that conversation with them to kind of work through that frustration and come up with coping mechanisms for overcoming that frustration. So that's another way you can do that. You do want to make sure that you're paying attention to your at-risk kids. So you'll probably know who they are after a few weeks. And so what this means is, rather than just shooting their parents an email or them an email or whatever, making phone calls. I think what's really interesting about the current practices in virtual classrooms now is that we're actually having to pick up the phone a little bit more than we had to before. Where before we were relying so much on technology for the communication, but it's not always the best way. So having a phone conversation with the parents or with the child, and getting a sense of what their needs are through that conversation as well, because what you might find is that what you thought might be causing the at risk, it could be something else completely, and so it gives you an understanding of that, and you can learn about that through that conversation. The second thing that you need to make sure that you do when you're working with students in a virtual environment in order to tend to their social emotional needs is to provide them with the platform to share their emotions. And this can be really simple. It could be something as simple as a check-in with students. What you see here is an emoji check-in where students would mark how they're feeling. If you have a student that shows sadness for a couple of days, you might want to, have a conversation with them. If you have a student that says they're feeling happy all the time, then you know that they're probably in a pretty good place. Although if one bothered face comes up, that might be cause for you to have a conversation with them, or just shoot them an email, or just to check in with them. So these check-ins should not just be done for the sake of doing them, that they should be used to gather information so that you can see when your students do have needs. Sometimes you can interweave these emotional check-ins. So for instance, if a student was reading a novel and there was a character, and you asked them to write from the perspective of that character, or you asked them to say how they would feel were they that character, you might get an insight into if they're frustrated or stressed or have anxiety. It could be that you have just reflection prompts, period, where you are asking students, how did you feel about this project, or how did you feel about your work on this, or whatever, and then the students are going to hopefully share with you, how they're feeling. And then what you can do is you can use this information to help you to tend to their needs. It's not meant to catch them doing something. It's not meant to, to get information from them that would be uncomfortable. It's simply giving them a platform to share their emotions. And when students have a chance to share their emotions, they'll oftentimes surprise you, because sometimes they haven't had a platform to do that before. And so they'll share things that they normally wouldn't. And you'll be able to get an idea of how to address those needs or work with that student when it comes to their social emotional needs. Another thing that you might want to consider is like having morning meetings. Morning meetings are at the beginning of the day. And then you ask questions of students. It could be something very innocuous, like, what is your favorite color and why? And so based on that, the way that the enthusiasm that student answers that question, or what they're, or you might say, like, what color are you associating yourself with lately? Or, if you were a candy bar, what candy bar would you be and why? And so questions like that are always fun, because kids can be creative, but it also, depending upon their answers, will give you, information that's going to be helpful for checking for signs for social emotional help. Another thing to consider is doing surveys with students. Sending out a survey through a Google form and asking them a few questions kind of mixed in there. And some of those questions are designed to try to elicit where they're at. It could be, having show and tell, even for high school students. I know show and tell it was a lot of times in elementary, but giving students a platform to share what they're proud of or what they're concerned with, or what they're how they're feeling, will again give you insight into where they're at. So consider doing show and tell with students. Lastly, of course, is that you want to have conversations with students. And one way to do this is in Zoom. There are breakout rooms, and you can, rather than have like a conversation in front of the whole class, you could do a breakout room and have a conversation with that student. You could give them a phone call. You could send them an email. There are all sorts of things that you can do to check in with them. But the important thing is that you do that check in with them. A lot of times you'll find that what's bothering them is nothing big, but it's still nice for them to know that someone cares enough about them to check in with them, because that relationship is really important for you to establish, is that students feel as though you care about them. If you're all business all the time, you're just all academics, students are going to wonder how much you care about them personally, and it's important that they feel that they're cared for. A third thing that you want to consider as a teacher is having explicit lessons that are working on their social emotional learning. So in other words, students should know that you are aware that they have social emotional needs and that you're giving them a platform to share these. Sometimes you can interweave these with some of the lessons, or you can get signs from things that aren't explicit. They're more subtle. But it's also important as a teacher that you occasionally set up really explicit things. So for example, one thing you could do is you could show a video on meditation, such as this one right here.
Thanks for gifting yourself these next few minutes. It's important to remember that you're a priority, and allowing yourself even just a few short minutes of intentional reflection can really have a positive impact on the rest of your day. So let's use these next few minutes to come back to center and set an intention for the rest of your day.
Something like this could be set up asynchronous, as in students just go in and do it on their own time. It could be an optional assignment. You might do it as a class. So you might have this video showing in your morning meeting, and students are doing this. But it is an explicit activity in order to get their minds and their emotions in check, and to make sure that they are addressing those. Another one to do is doing brain breaks. Again, sometimes we get caught up with the academics too much and we don't give kids a break. And it can be especially difficult in a virtual setting where they're sitting all day, which can be really tough. And so you might do something like, say, for the next hour, you are going to work on this. Having them do an activity such as this coloring page will be something that will kind of slow their brain down a little bit, cause them to pause, hopefully give them some space to reflect. And this is not just for elementary kids. This is something where kids have to focus on something that's not so academic in nature, and allows them to decompress a little bit, and just take a break. We need to be sure in a virtual setting that we're giving students the chance to take breaks, and not just your typical breaks because they don't have that in between classes, or walking between classes, or talking with friends. And so we need to be purposeful about that. So for instance, you could have kids do an in-house scavenger hunt. You can say, go find 5 things that have to do with this. And it's just something fun where they're going around and they're being active. You can encourage them to go on walks. You can encourage them to get up and, get up from their seat and move around. But basically trying to get kids so they're not staring at a screen all day long. Even though they're in a virtual setting and you want them to get out and about and be active, there are things that you can do in the virtual setting that allows them to, explicitly work on their social emotional needs. So here is a website right here, Pathways to Success, and lots of great resources on here. But here they list calming website activities and games. Like this one's really, I think, hilarious. It's do nothing for 2 minutes. And it just is a timer. And if you move your mouse at all, it makes you start over again. So they're asking you not to touch the mouse or the keyboard, and just to really focus on that 2 minutes and doing nothing. I thought that one was really clever. There are other ones. So like a jigsaw puzzle, so you can do something non-academic and just create a puzzle. So obviously these are for younger kids, but they actually can get into 49-piece puzzles. So but students would go on here and they would be doing something that's not necessarily academic, but they would be able to figure out ways to do what they're going to do. So that's another one right there. And on this site, they list other things like animal live cams from different zoos, guided meditation videos, like the one I showed before, calming apps that students can have, but basically, or calming activities. So these are all a bunch of really good virtual activities that kids can do to be purposeful about working on their social emotional needs. The fourth and final suggestion I'm going to give to you is the need to model this behavior yourself. So in other words, we as teachers also need to make sure that we are not getting emotionally overwhelmed or full of anxiety. There's a lot of stuff that is changing, a lot of stuff that is different. And so as teachers, we need to model for students as much as possible how we're handling things and how we're human and how we have emotions. So if something goes wrong with technology, which undoubtedly it will, just play it off as being a technology problem and not something to worry about so much. And then maybe they won't be so worried when something like that happens to them. When you're doing these activities like the morning meetings, participating in those and letting them see how you are feeling as well is really important. This goes back to the idea of what the flight attendant, when you're flying on a plane, will say to you in an event of cabin pressure, lack of cabin pressure, the mask will fall. Make sure you put your own on first before you put on the person that's with you. The reason being is that you can't help other people if you yourself are in trouble. So this is kind of the same thing. Make sure you're taking care of yourself and model this to students. And that way you can take care of their social emotional needs as well. So this might mean joining a PLC, or it might be that you're doing a teacher-based team or just having a group of colleagues that you can talk to. It could be even doing a Twitter chat where you get to, one that's really good is Paul Solars's Learn Like a Pirate. He has a chat every Monday at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern, where teachers can come on and talk about, whatever the topic is and bounce ideas off one another. But, as a teacher, we have to have outlets as well and ways that we are working on our social emotional needs so that we can then do that for our students as well.